all these platforms, it kind of relies on things being anonymous, being impersonal. Sometimes when I do buy things, it shows up with a small imperfection, like the object. And I love that imperfection. I'm like, this is because, it's not like the iPhone factory made it, right? It's some small family business that made this, and there's this imperfection.
Hello, and welcome to the Culture and Technology podcast. I'm your host, Severin Matusek. Imagine this. It's the day before a costume party, and you don't know what to wear yet. I don't get invited to many costume parties, but when I do, I want to have the right thing to wear. But usually, I don't have much time, so I go online, I look for inspiration, and once I find something, I order it at Amazon or Alibaba. It's easy. Shipping time is less than 24 hours. Tomorrow, I'll have my costume, and I'm ready to party. Yay. But have you ever thought about who actually makes that costume and how it gets to your place that fast?
You start digging into it and you're like, this is like some rural manufacturer in China.
This is Xiaowei Wang. Xiaowei is a technologist, artist, and author of the book Blockchain Chicken Farm. It's a fascinating book that investigates how technology is being used in rural China and how it transforms people's lives. There are many important lessons in this book, but if I had to sum up my main takeaway, it's that the internet connects all of us in ways we don't even think of. In other words, the costume that I just ordered for my party here in Europe was being made literally a few days before by a family in a remote Chinese village. How does digital commerce change culture then? And how does it transform our human relationships? That's what I wanted to find out in my conversation with Xiaowei Wang. Welcome, Xiaowei.
Thank you so much for having me.
So how did life change for you since last year? I guess you were traveling a lot before, researching for your book in China, and suddenly things shut down in the US about a year ago. How was last year for you?
Yeah, I think, very similar to a lot of people, it was this really slowing down time and kind of time to reflect. So that felt really important. But it was also very surreal because before the pandemic, I was doing a lot of research in rural China and in China. And there was definitely, this moment where China was in pretty severe lockdown. But then by October or November of last year, we were still pretty stuck at home, all these things. And then talking to people that I visited in China, their lives were pretty much back to normal. And that was also very strange. And so, I think over the past year, just thinking more about, what's the next step in my work more broadly, and also kind of developing new, I guess, related, but more new research interests on kind of subjects of health and healing and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know if you picked it up last year, but I saw that you do tarot card reading. Does that come from last year where you had the time to start something like that?
So I've been reading tarot since high school, really. But, I think I always joke, people who read tarot professionally do professional witchcraft stuff. They're always logged off. They're not really online. They're not flying to conferences and giving talks. They're really in that monastic life. And so it wasn't until pandemic came where I was like, well, I don't really have these new ways of meeting new people. So tarot reading seems like this great way to spend an hour with someone and they're a complete stranger and all of a sudden they start crying and you're just like, wow, this is intense, but also really rich. And it was, I guess, maybe a way of addressing the fact that I wasn't meeting new people during the pandemic.
And because anyone can go to your website, actually fill out a form and apply to, meet you as a stranger for an hour of tarot card reading. What were some of the experiences you had? Because I've never done it even in real life. So I wonder, you being in Oakland, California, someone from somewhere else in the world joining, you don't know that person, and you're sitting in a Zoom call reading tarot cards and they're bursting out in tears. What sort of connection were you able to build with people through that?
It was really, I think, powerful, actually, and a reminder that a lot of the common human emotions during this time, right? We're watching this collective trauma unfold. There's a ton of grief, whether it's grieving that we can't have a great dinner in Sweden together, or grieving that, literal grief for family members, for former ways of life. It was really incredible to see all these common emotions and threads, no matter where in the world people were, right? They could, be in Alabama, of all places, to, the UK or other regions throughout the world. And yeah, just tapping into this deep connection was truly incredible. I've definitely had sustained connections too, which has been really great. Like now I have all these internet friends. And when I say how we met, it's like, oh yeah, I gave them a tarot reading and now I feel really close to them. But I think the process of tarot reading is very weirdly dissimilar to design research, where you're just kind of holding this space for people to really explore and process through their emotions. And my only job as a tarot reader is to kind of say, here's the symbolism I'm seeing. What is your relation to this symbolism?
Mm-hmm. I think it's quite interesting because obviously a lot of people over the last year sought new ways of connecting to people, either through Zoom calls with family members that are very far away, or through social media, or through other, ways. I think the fact that you started tarot reading, via your own form, it speaks very much for your approach to technology, because I think you are quite critical about the mainstream ways of how technology is being used and what sort of relationships come out of that. So was there some systematic thinking behind it of just, trying something different that's not being imposed by a large platform in order to make money, but something that you came up with yourself?
Definitely. So I think it's been really interesting. So you brought up social media as this increased way of connection. And I was joking with someone the other day, Instagram's the worst now because it's basically Twitter. People are screenshotting tweets and posting them on Instagram, which wasn't really happening before the pandemic. And everyone's kind of saying their opinion. And it's half an invitation to connect because everything kind of devolves. It's hard to have this rich conversation in public online, right? And so I love tarot because it is very private. It is very one-on-one. It's also really interesting because, so the people who come to me for readings, this is also probably a result of personal networks, but there's some set of people who don't work in tech and they just want to connect, artists, writers. But a lot of those folks, they already have their own personal kind of tarot or spiritual practice already. A large set of people who have come to me during the pandemic are tech workers in some way, at all different levels and stages of their career. And there's this kind of question, what am I doing, right? I'm a tech worker. I'm working from home. All this terrible stuff is happening out in the world. I feel powerless. Am I really making the world better by improving the music algorithm, recommendation algorithm? What am I doing with my life? What should I be doing with my life? And I think it's really fascinating that the people who are working so close, the closest to the things that are defining what it means to be human today, are also having this moment of existential crisis.
I agree. And I definitely want to go into that later. But for now, first of all, here's your book. I got it here. Congrats on your book. I read it over the last few weeks, and I thought it was really very inspiring and very personal as well. And I loved the reflections that you had in there. And, I also saw the trajectory of, you gave a talk 2 years ago when we met at the conference in Malmö that was already related to some of the research, and the keynote that I saw today was already building on that and adding more to that. And I think, if for people who haven't read the book, and also by just reading the title, Blockchain Chicken Farm and Other Stories of Taking China's Countryside, you give great examples of, farmers in China using AI to surveil porks, or, Taobao villages and so on. And so there's some great examples. But I felt when I read your book, there's more to that. It's not just giving examples and doing research and observing. I think you very nicely interweaved it with your personal story, and it became a sort of exploration for you personally to find out certain things or clarify certain things. And your approach to the book, I think, was deeply personal in also who you are and where you come from as an American with Chinese immigrant parents and so on. So can you tell us a little bit about your life in the US growing up, and, having that relationship to China that ultimately led you possibly to research and write that book?
Yeah, that's a great question. The other day, a friend sent me like this meme that's like the 5 types of diaspora immigrant writing in the US, kind of buckets of diaspora writing. I was like, I'm guilty of all of these.
Okay.
But at the same time, like, I do think it's really interesting because there's kind of like a default writing. So when I started researching the book, one thing I always felt growing up was like, the like Chinese culture is always like the other, and you're always kind of trying to explain it, make it legible. And so when I started writing my book, I think drawing upon these childhood experiences, like I talk about it in my book, helping my aunt, who is this recent immigrant, sell things at her like little outdoor stand. And just the things that I was noticing as a child of like what people thought like made in China or being Chinese meant, and all those projections. And I think the book is deeply personal, but also at the same time, the flip side of that is that there's a lot of these books that are not personal and kind of written about China more broadly. And embodied in that, I think ultimately is like a personal motivation, right? And personal understandings of what innovation means, or, how the world should work, like what intellectual property should mean in the world. And so I think that even though those books seem neutral, those are also quite personal to me. And, my book is just another personal edition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love the personal angle to it, because one can really follow your thoughts, and you also describe how you visit certain family members and, what you eat. And actually also I wanted to ask you about those recipes. There are spread throughout the book, Sino-futuristic recipes, as you call them, where, yeah, I think you describe some food scenarios of the future. How did you come up with those?
Yeah, so the recipes actually came before the book.
Okay.
I think so a few years ago, just starting to play with this idea of recipes as a format, because it's, I think people don't take recipes seriously because honestly, it's like seen as like in the kitchen, kind of feminized labor. Like, what can it really offer us, right? But I think it can offer a lot. You look at recipe books throughout time. Like, I have this collection of like 1930s recipes, 1950s recipes, 1980s recipes, and just even tracing that. Like, it's not just the style of writing, but also what's available as ingredients. All of that is changing in response to war, like the things that are World War II recipes, very different than what we would want to eat. Things are changing in response to refrigeration and shipping containers and global trade. And it is this way, this encapsulation of change in daily life, through something that's very embodied. And so, yeah, I wanted to make like a little zine of recipes that were speculative. They're supposed to be funny, playful. I think that's like an important vehicle to like not take things too seriously, and really think about like the food of the future. and what that means about the ways that tech and culture and society has evolved.
Can you give an example of one recipe of the future that might give us a hint of how tech and culture evolve in the future?
Yeah, so one recipe I have is this called maize mooncakes. Mm-hmm. And so this is actually the true part, which is a lot of countries in their space program are trying to think through ways of growing food on the moon or mining the moon. So just the moon as another resource. Mm-hmm. But China started germinating these seeds as part of their space program on the moon. And so my speculation, kind of thinking through it, food and like feeding the nation has always been this recurring theme. Like, what if there was moon grown corn and that corn becomes this luxury that you can use to put into the center of mooncakes? And that's kind of sold during the Mid-Autumn Festival.
I also want to talk about technology, but also our agency within technology, which I think, at the end of your book is one of the main topics you go into, because you basically say it's too easy to criticize technology for what it is or for, whatever direction it takes. We still have to understand that technology is a result of our culture, of our communities, and we still have agency in shaping it. You don't take the excuse of just saying, oh, there are these big tech firms and there's no escape. We can't do anything about it. We just have to keep on playing within the system. How did that realization come about? Because I feel like at the end of the book, it's really, you try to conclude all these observations that you've made in rural China and try to meditate about what you do with them. And you come to that conclusion that, okay, we need to do something about it. I need to do something about it. I need to act in order to change something. And, and it doesn't really make sense to think about a future where it might be different, because we now live in the present and that's the only chance we have.
Yeah, I think very much this moment, right? Where I think about, these tarot readings that I've given to friends and my network who are tech workers. And it's like, it is much easier to keep showing up to your job, keep doing the things that, your project manager at your tech company wants you to do. But it's not like you necessarily want to, right? You might have all these other reasons, like whether it's money to take care of your family or your own personal ideas of what success means. That's kind of like, oh, I can't leave. And, for everyone, it's going to be different. There's no blanket answer, but it doesn't mean that, there aren't these other ways of like thinking through or being in the world. Because on the other hand, I think of like my public school teacher friends who they're like, yeah, I teach public school. I don't make a ton of money. I have to do like these part-time jobs to like, make ends meet. But I'm also like working with kids day to day in the public school system, and that feels meaningful. So I think as a reminder that there's like all these different ways of being, and that like we can't hold off, just for this like future. A good example is, there was one person who was working at this big tech company, and they really wanted to leave and start like a, progressive kindergarten. And I was like, well, you could do that now. There's kind of like a big need for childcare, all these things. And they were like, no, I just can't leave. And I was like, is it financial? Is it? And they were like, no, I just feel like I can't leave until I do like 5 years because of my CV and like all these things. And I was like, well, once you start a kindergarten, like, will your like Google CV really matter? And they were just like, I guess not, but I just haven't thought about like it's hard to take a leap. And so it is hard to take a leap. And yeah, I think that's what I mean when I think about the present. Yeah. I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, I'm just curious about your own personal work when it comes to that, because you mentioned that one of the main projects you're currently working on is the Logic School. So maybe you can also introduce a little bit what Logic Magazine is and how the Logic School adds up to that.
Yeah, so Logic Magazine, we've been publishing for 5 years now and very much have like a print first philosophy. We're not trying to get into the web content land. I'm sure you know this, but it's like trying to produce web content is like, it's like people expect fresh content every day.
Yeah.
So,
Don't go into that.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's not sustainable. So we're a print publication and we take a realistic but also critical view on tech and culture. And so we have everything from like reports of, we gave someone money to try on this like brain helmet that would read your brain waves and to like report back honestly and with a more maybe theoretical framework about it and taking into social context. And in this upcoming issue, we interview someone who's like an activist doing distributed web work. So yeah, I think that's like our like range of what we're looking at.
Is the audience tech workers who, want to think more critically about what they do and how they create tech?
Yes, I would say the audience is like people who enjoy reading Wired magazine, but like want maybe a little bit more of a political or leftist commentary. Not that Wired doesn't do that, but I think just like more of it. And so really trying to create and bridge the dialogue between people who are working at a lot of big companies and in tech, and then people who are activists who are trying to push at it from the outside. And yeah, I think creating that dialogue, but also hoping that tech workers feel a sense of agency to really start changing things in the day-to-day at their work, that they do have the power, right? Because so much of work is like, I think managers trying to make their workers feel powerless, but that's, trying to push against that.
Yeah, it very much relates to a conversation we had yesterday with an artist, German artist, Cornelia Solfrank, who was one of the first net art pioneers and already in 1997 used techniques from hacker culture to hijack an institutional art competition. And until today, basically uses strategies like hijacking or strategies taken from hacker culture in order to infiltrate art and question certain things. So would you say this is something that people working in technology should do more to, try and hijack the system, basically?
Yeah, one of the things that was really interesting in our space, this realization was like, oh, one of the very basic things as a tech worker is that you work at a big company that has a lot of money and you can reroute funds like from your company into activist orgs, right? You can kind of start to make your coworkers think differently. If you're like, all of these big companies, they have like lunchtime talks where they bring in outside guests. Sometimes it's artists, and you can start bringing in activists and just like give them a couple $1,000s to like come and speak at your company, and really starting exactly like that planting of a seed for people. And also just in the one-on-one conversations and interactions that you have with your coworkers, like that, I think in the workplace, there's always this like sense of like, oh, I have to reach my goals for work or else I'm going to get a bad performance review. But if you can start creating this alternative set of relations in the workplace, this other kind of space where it's not about failure or success, like your coworkers would probably want to join that space far more than they want to please the manager, right? Because it's like a space where you can be held and supported. So yeah, very much like trying to hijack, reroute, create these other spaces within workplaces.
I think it's quite fascinating to see it because this happens a lot within tech now, right? There's more and more workers of tech companies forming unions or fighting for unions. So from an outsider's perspective, it feels like, yes, people understand they have agency and people understand they have responsibility in working at these big companies. And I would even say that, someone like you with Logic Magazine and also like as the author of that book together with Jenny Odell, for example, who wrote Resisting the Attention Economy, and a few other authors who are based at the very heart, in the San Francisco Bay Area. There is a movement forming somehow. It's still small and a little bit underground, but more and more people are joining, right? Do you feel like you're sort of part of a movement of more and more people doing that?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely feels that way, especially as like, time goes on and we all like kind of know the same people. Like it's,
So are you all friends? Is everyone like, do you have like a local club where everyone meets?
I see Jenny occasionally at Tacos Oscar, which is this taco place. Sorry, very Bay Area. That's like in a shipping container, and their whole thing is like organic, small farm tacos. If you're next time you're in the Bay, I will take you.
Okay, it's a great way to resist the attention economy to have organic tacos, I would say.
Exactly. Yeah, but just like I think like similar networks of people. I think there's definitely like, for me, the Processing Foundation, this open source software, works a lot with artists and activists. Lauren McCarthy and Dorothy Santos kind of spearhead a lot of their work there. That's been like a nice hub of energy. And they really focus on connecting people who are in this like tech movement, activism work. So insofar there's a movement as in like people who all know each other and care about the same things. Yes, totally. Yeah, I appreciate that it looks like there's a coherent movement to you from the outside.
Yes, somehow I observed that. Great. Well, there was actually one more thing I wanted to ask you, which is specifically about commerce and culture, because at several points in your book, you admit that you love shopping. So,
don't you?
Well, I'm not sure if I love shopping, honestly. I don't shop too much. I don't know. But I understand. And of course, you're not the only one, but you're very much, basically your book is about e-commerce, right? It's about Taobao, which is part of Alibaba. Alibaba is probably the largest e-commerce site in the world that, changes so much of culture right now. And you kind of question your own relationship to shopping, to the real life implications that you observed in China. So has your relationship to shopping changed because of the book?
Yes, I do love shopping. It's such like, but part of it is like the things that I end up buying are like, I end up not actually buying that much. There's just something about the pleasure of looking and like fantasizing about like my new life with whatever thing, right? It's very relaxing. I do think that, now it's been really, oh God, especially during this pandemic, it's been really fascinating going onto Amazon. Like, I don't know if this happened in Austria, but in the US, there was like the huge like toilet paper shortage.
Yeah, it happened here as well. Yeah. It swapped over.
Okay, cool. So I would go onto Amazon and, just based off of like I feel like as part of being an internet researcher, having this fascination with like what's going on online, right? So on Reddit, people are like, go to Amazon, you can buy toilet paper there. And I would go onto Amazon and just see like, toilet paper I'm like, I've seen that brand before. It's like sold in China and these exorbitant prices, being set. And I was like, this is like this crazy direct from China, small time entrepreneurs on their hustle, economy in action. And more, the other day, my partner was trying to buy like a tent for camping. And I went online looking at these tents, and all of them are like these off-label brands. And you start digging into it and you're like, this is like some rural manufacturer in China. There was a great article by Peter Hessler in the New Yorker about these like small entrepreneurs in China starting to list things on Amazon. And it's like 39% of Amazon sellers now are direct from China sellers. And so, it is like, it's changed my shopping in the sense that like, I go onto Amazon and, I don't buy things, but I just love looking and being like, what are these weird companies? Can I try and find their address somewhere? It's a weird hobby.
Well, I guess it's because you experienced firsthand that there are real people and real families behind that, right? I found it quite fascinating when reading your book that you gave the example that you visited that small town factory full of town workers sewing these costumes. And then back in the US, you looked for it on Amazon, and on page 3, you saw that very costume, which is a funny experience. And all of us are on Amazon, several times a week probably, but we don't really associate these products to real people. But what your book shows is these are real people and real families making a living and innovating in some way behind that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And establishing that connection feels extremely important, especially at a time when all these platforms, it kind of relies on things being anonymous, being impersonal, and just, I don't know, I get really just fascinated when I see sometimes when I do buy things, it shows up with a small imperfection, like the object. And I love that imperfection. I'm like, this is because, it's not like the iPhone factory made it, right? It's some small family business that made this, and there's this imperfection. So I love that.
This episode was recorded in May 2021 during Creative Days, an annual conference that gathers creative minds from around the world in Vienna. If you are curious to find out more about the work of Xiaowei, Logic Magazine, and their book Blockchain Chicken Farm, check out the show notes in your podcast app. You will find everything we talked about there and in more detail. The Culture and Technology podcast is produced by the Vienna Business Agency. The Vienna Business Agency supports businesses, the economy, and the city to develop Vienna's creative industries further. My name is Severin, over and out. Until next time.